Welcome to Talk to Al Jazeera in the field with me, Barnaby Phillips, in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Now, this is a city that has played a big part in my life. I spent some very happy childhood years here, years I have vivid memories of, although I left when I was only 10 years old, way back in 1978. I've returned for a reporting stint for Al Jazeera, and it's fascinating for me personally to see the changes Nairobi has undergone these past 40 years. Changes in some cases for the better, and in some cases for the worse. To help me understand Nairobi's journey, I've been talking to some experts, Kenyans of my generation, who can help explain where this city has come from and where it might be going. In the 1970s, Kenya was celebrated as an African success story. Newly independent, politically stable, economically strong. Nairobi, its proud capital. It was caught between two identities. Nairobi was founded by the British, and that colonial influence was still strong. But it was trying to redefine itself as a modern African city. In the 70s, just like today, it was a place of inequality. A few lived well, most struggled to survive. But the fundamental change between the Nairobi I knew as a boy and the city of today is one of size. The population has grown 800%. A small, manageable city has become a vast metropolis. Right. My first stop was at the downtown arts complex run by Joy Mboya. She's a woman of many talents, actor, singer, architect, and defender of Nairobi's heritage. Now, in the 1970s, Kenya was a de facto one-party state. Few dared question President Jomo Kenyatta. Today, it's a multi-party democracy. So I wanted Joy to tell me if Nairobi's artists now have more freedom of expression.
Since our sort of multi-party elections, and particularly 2002, we in the cultural sector began to notice a shift. We saw a younger generation sort of pick up the baton, so to speak, from previous artists and be bolder in terms of the themes that they were tackling with music, with spoken word. We saw new art forms emerging, contemporary dance, sort of sprang into the scene. And then, of course, now with this sort of digital age, we're seeing a lot more younger people picking up cameras and expressing and sharing through those media as well. So yeah, so definitely a much more exciting space. I know that sort of 15 years ago, when a visitor would come to Nairobi and sort of say to us, what can we go and see? We kind of had to stretch our, sort of minds a little bit and say, well, shall we point them to this or point them to that? But now the city is full of something to do every single day that's connected to the arts. So it's actually very, very vibrant.
Has the city preserved its history during that time? Has it preserved what might have been good about the early independence years?
Well, I don't know. I mean, being my age and sort of seeing looking at the generation now that, we sort of say the Kenyan population, average age 19, a very young population. One of the things that I think is missing is a disconnect, a lack of continuity between the period before and now. So that when you're looking at an understanding of history, if you're looking at a connection between those who were the so-called movers and shakers in any of our sectors then and now, there is little knowledge, little continuity of that sort of understanding between the generations, which I think is a pity.
That surely is the big change, isn't it? A city of 500,000 has become a city of what?
4.5, yeah, 4.5 million.
Maybe 5, some people tell me.
That's right.
That's an incredible change in such a short period of time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think if you walk around the city today, of course, roadworks, construction, densification, sort of spaces that maybe, if you were in this city 30 years ago, you probably would have found a lot of open green spaces. A lot of those are gone. But I think the interesting and exciting thing is that there's an understanding within the city planning offices themselves now around sort of moving forward and creating a sustainable, healthy city. And so we have been fortunate enough to be part of those conversations of trying to think about how do we inventorize the public spaces, reclaim them, and make them, spaces that the public can now use, make a city that is sort of concerned around walkability and livability. Do we have too many cars? Yes, of course we do. How do we sort of encourage people to cycle? How do we sort of say that there's nothing wrong with walking? How do we sort of begin to think about a public transport system that is not choked by many, many, many little matatus, that you sort of have something that's a bit more, kind of coherent and systematic. So these are things that we're actually discussing now, and I think that is important.
You sound like a bold visionary, but you also sound like someone who's very optimistic. When I think about the demographic pressures,
right.
When I think about, I'm sorry to say, how this city and this country is associated with corruption, is anyone listening to you when you talk about cycle paths or restoring parks in the city centre and that kind of thing?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that always there's some individuals who, within these spaces, within public space, government, who are open-minded and who are looking ahead. And I know that certainly the individuals who are currently sitting in the Nairobi Urban Planning Department are very open-minded, are very proactive, and are very visionary.
Be honest with me here. If a Nairobian of the 1960s or 70s could be transplanted into this city of 2017, would they be horrified or would they be proud of what had happened here?
I think they'd be horrified to some extent, I think, because I think that there's a lot of unplanned development that has taken place. If you look at the city, some parts of the city are actually very, very filthy. Garbage collection, incomplete roadworks, construction that's actually not been planned properly. So yes, I think that they'd be horrified.
What are your biggest regrets personally of opportunities Nairobi might have missed since independence?
Oh my, I think that, just the planning. I think that was a missed opportunity. I think that we inherited a city that of course was a colonial city, and we had a chance to begin to think about how do we sort of become urban Africans, if I can sort of phrase it that way, and what sort of African city, if there's such a thing, do we want to be in? I think we didn't have that conversation. I think that of course there were other pressing things. We were worrying about education, we were worrying about industry, we were worrying about the economy, but we were not thinking about these things in the way that we now think about them, that the urban infrastructure or any sort of infrastructure that you're putting down, of course, is coherent with all of the other things that you're planning. And so now I think we're realizing that holistic approach, which we are beginning to adopt, was something that we probably should have looked at really early on. And the effects are clear. The effects are clear.
I can recall from the 70s certainly that my Kenyan friends, if you ask them where they're from, they never really said Nairobi. They said, I'm Kikuyu, I'm from Mount Kenya, I'm Luo, I'm from Kisumu, or wherever they were from. If I ask young Kenyans today, do people think they are Nairobians? Do they think of themselves as Nairobians?
I don't think so. I think that the majority don't, actually.
So that sense of identity is still not here?
It's a work in progress, because I know that about, sort of half a decade ago, we started a conversation around Nairobi identity. And of course, it was very clear to us that many of us do not see ourselves as Nairobians. Nairobi is still that place where we come for work, we come for school, we probably raise our families to a certain extent here, and then we will go and retire somewhere else. But there is still a generation now that is born here, and that actually has now weaker ties with the so-called rural base. And that is, for me, the beginning of that Nairobian. And one of the things that I'm keen to see is how do they sort of take ownership of this space, as their home? How do they engage with it? How do they participate in making it the sort of city that they would like it to be? Yeah.
The story of Nairobi is in many ways, I suppose, a typical story of a post-independence African city. Incredible demographic growth, enormous wealth for some, but terrible inequalities as well. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's clear. I mean, in fact, when you look at this city, of course, this city was a segregated city before independence, and you can see the effects of that segregation.
Yes,
but now
the British had white areas, Indian areas, black areas.
Absolutely.
That doesn't exist
anymore? That doesn't exist so much in that sense. You're now seeing it more as an economic segregation. So you see that the eastern part of the city is where you probably have the lower income groups, really congested, tight development, unplanned development over there. And then you sort of have the other part of the city, the western part of the city, which were then, the former white neighborhoods, where again there is, sort of a densification of structure, but more pleasant spaces to live in, and actually people who are economically well off. So the city is, yes, definitely segregated along economic lines. Many people in the city are struggling to earn a livelihood. Many people are unemployed in the city. So it is not a city that is a welcoming city, a comfortable city for the newcomer. Yeah.
And yet it is a city that the newcomer continues to flock to from all over Kenya. Why?
Everybody's hopeful, I think, thinking that they will probably be the lucky one to get a job or to be able to start something, a small business, or whether it's selling bananas by the roadside or fixing a car or being a cobbler or whatever it is. I think everybody thinks that there is enough of a population, enough of an opportunity. And I think the other thing that we saw just in our discussions around identity was that the city is a space that allows you to, in a sense, cut ties from tradition and heritage. You can remake yourself. And I think that a number of young people probably find that the city is a space where they can remake themselves, they can imagine themselves to be something else. But of course, they then also find that it's not automatic, it's very hard, and it can be quite disillusioning.
Let's look forward 10 years. What would you most like to change in Nairobi to make this a better city for the millions of people who live here?
Oh, in 10 years' time, and 10 years is a really short time. But one of the things that I hope we would have is just dealing with the transport. I don't live very far away from where I work. On a good day, it would probably take me about 15, 18 minutes. When I leave here at 6 o'clock trying to head home, it could take me an hour, it could take me an hour and a half. So the congestion on the roads, just that planning of urban transportation, I think, is absolutely critical. But then I think the other thing that I hope would happen with sort of infrastructure development is also just a sense of our own civic engagement and pride in who we are as Nairobians. How do our governors sort of instill, promote, encourage that sort of sense of being a proud Nairobian, a Nairobian who engages, a Nairobian who asks, a Nairobian who participates. I'm hoping that in 10 years' time, it'll be a different Nairobian, and people will say, I'm a proud Nairobian.
Nairobi is fast becoming a high-rise city, tall buildings springing up all over the place. But is the city losing its identity during this process? I've been talking to one of Nairobi's leading architects. Charles Kahura has watched and participated in Nairobi's transformation. Does he see any continuity with the city of the 1970s?
The economy has changed, the population has changed, people are different, the culture, the intermingling, the urbanization. So many things have changed that Nairobi certainly wouldn't be there. A bit of it is there, a bit of the rural aspect of Nairobi. There's the remnants of it you can feel, but infrastructurally, we've got a totally different city.
And that process of change, if anything, seems to be accelerating in recent years.
It's actually, it changes year on, year out. Nairobi 10 years ago is a totally different Nairobi from the Nairobi 10 years prior to that. And if you actually move it a little shorter, Nairobi in 5 years changes a lot. In 2 years changes a lot. The infrastructure definition of roads in the last 5 years alone in the city of Nairobi is so much that a person who was here 5 years ago would actually need a guided tour to get their way around.
Giant roads that did not exist.
Overpasses, we have underpasses, we have dual carriageways that didn't exist. We have 4 lanes on roads. If you go to the lower income areas, neighborhoods as well, within a year, you'd actually need a guided tour to get to where you were going. That's how rapid the transformation is in Nairobi.
Because even slum areas are growing very, very quickly.
Essentially so. They also grow in their own definition, the roads, the growth of it. Most of it is driven by the demand for housing, the demand for accommodation, the demand for business enterprises. So if you look at the slum areas, again, their growth is also astronomical in terms of populace. So that population has to be accommodated. If you look at the middle income areas, the same kind of thing. If you look at the commercial areas, the demand for commercial space has actually, it drives the demand for infrastructural definition.
All these incredible skyscrapers which have gone up and which are still going up, and I gather even more are planned in the coming years, higher and higher. Where's the money coming from? Is it Kenyan money or is it international money pouring into this city?
There's a lot of Kenyan money, a lot of it. There's a lot of international money from international investors, international establishments who have established themselves here, like banks, insurance companies, you'll find them defining a lot of the commercial enterprise. There's a lot of partnerships, especially within the commercial sector, with respect to retail outlets. Okay, so that brings in a lot of external money to local money. Most of the residential developments is actually internal money. The lowest developer, the least investor in terms of development in this country is government. Because apart from the infrastructure, the roads and the railways and other road infrastructure systems, government hasn't done many serious projects that actually define Nairobi in itself. In fact, I wouldn't place more than 3 or 4 done by government.
Is there a danger that Nairobi will become, or perhaps already has become, yet another anonymous city of glass and steel towers that could frankly be anywhere in the world?
Unfortunately, yes. Because what's the character of Nairobi? You can't pick it out. Which building would you attribute to having some character in Nairobi? Apart from KICC, the Kenyatta National Conference Center, which had some cultural definition, the rest just takes its own shape. Architects just get their own thing. They get their own design and shoot it up, and you not pick any character and say this is Nairobi.
You failed as architects to give this city identity.
We have not made a conscious decision to do that, and we have not. It's not driven by any institution. It's unfortunate, but well, again, it's what drives it? It's the demands of the populace.
I've come to the neighbourhood where I lived as a little boy, Kilimani, although to be honest, I can barely recognise it today, with all the construction and traffic and new roads that have come in. I've come here to meet someone who's fighting hard to preserve this neighbourhood and improve the lives of everyone who lives here.
Irungu Houghton has been arrested and suffered death threats in his struggles with unscrupulous developers and land grabbers who are looking to cash in on Nairobi's property boom. So is Irungu losing his battle to save the city's environment?
I think yes, any attempt to try and keep the city the way it was either in the 60s or the 70s will fail. What we have to recognize is that demographic pressure and people coming to the city relentlessly is actually transforming the city. And so we need a city that is actually able to absorb these large numbers of people. But we also need green spaces, and we do need recreational spaces, and we need public spaces. And we do need public utilities to match the private investment that's happening. Because if you don't have that, then essentially we just call it organized chaos. And it is, the case that you can have an apartment block next to a school, next to a petrol station, next to a nightclub, and sometimes even a garage, and that just doesn't work for many people. So I think one of the things we need to push for as citizens and as residents of Nairobi is really, organized planning, so that you do have residential areas and clusters of business and clusters of industry, but that you don't have all this mingled together.
But when land is worth, as you've been telling me, literally millions of dollars for small plots around here, where, I'm sorry to say it, so many officials are corrupt, that seems a very difficult battle to fight.
No, land prices in Nairobi are just crazy. I mean, we have 1 acre in various parts of the city can be millions and millions of shillings, and I think what's happened is that it's really gone out of control. It's highly speculative. What you get for the land is not necessarily what the value is, but what's happening is people are just thinking vertically, right? So the first thing they'll do when they buy a 1 acre plot with one bungalow that probably is £1 million is that they will knock down the bungalow and put up a 90 unit property. And that's really what we have next to me now, a 90 unit building that used to be on a bungalow for really about maybe 5 occupants. That's going to be at least, I don't know, it's probably maybe about 250 people.
So you can have 250 neighbours instead of 5 neighbours.
Sure, I used to have 5 neighbours to talk to. Now I've got 250 to contend with.
Built by the Chinese.
Built by the Chinese at 3% interest.
Is Nairobi a dysfunctional city?
I mean, where it's unplanned and where it's not serviced and where there are no utilities, waste and sanitation breaks down, as we've seen in the last few months, it is completely dysfunctional. We've had cases of cholera outbreaks. We've had cases of noise pollution. I mean, Kilimani is now sadly known for its nightclubs. Not so much that they are great nightclubs, and I'm sure for those who are in the nightclubs they're great, but really for the residents who can't sleep at night because you have a 24-hour nightclub. Booming music.
Or you might have people building for 24 hours.
Well, yeah, we had that. I mean, this neighbor of ours tried to do this for a month, and then we had to go to the court because fortunately there are laws and bylaws that prevent people from building 24 hours. But the sad thing is that not enough citizens know how to exercise those laws and essentially exercise their rights.
I'm sure there'll be people watching this who'll say, well, you know, what are these two old-timers complaining about? This is progress, this is development, this is Nairobi becoming a modern city.
Yeah, but we have to remember it's our city. It's not being modernized for anybody else but us. And I think what's important is to make it a livable city and make it a city of choice, a place where we would choose to live here rather than simply a place we go to work. And then one day, mythically, we will return to some ancestral home and go and die there. I think we have to say this is our city and we claim it. And we do this, you know, every day. We organize groups of residents to go out and plant trees because we're losing the trees and the tree foliage is disappearing in the city. That's our responsibility, not just the government's.
You're an eloquent, well-connected person, and this is a middle class or in places a very affluent neighborhood. Is it a realistic model for those enormous slums, places like Kibera, Mathare, for them to try and organize their neighborhoods and fight back against the powers that be in the same way?
You know, you'll be really surprised. When we set up the community foundation, the Kilimani Project Foundation, we had the hardest conversations with middle class people. And they kept asking, why do you need a community foundation in this area? Surely we have everything. And what we said to them is, the reason you have everything is you privatize everything. If we stripped you of your income, you wouldn't have reliable sources of energy. You wouldn't have electricity. You wouldn't have reliable sources of water. You wouldn't have security. You've privatized everything and forgotten that actually these are all public services. Now, for the people in Mathare and in Korogosho and the neighboring communities of Kibra and Kangware, they've had to fight for these services. And the difference between them and us, I think, is actually urban poor communities are better organized than urban middle class communities. And that sounds strange, but it is true. The level of distance and the level of relatedness gets higher the more affluent you get. And I think that's the secret that we need to understand, because as we begin to see an end to absolute poverty and people begin to rise up, what I feel is missing is the ability to organize across communities. And that's what we're seeing from middle class communities. Middle class communities don't fight for anything. They simply just pay up when they have a service removed from them. So I think, in contrast, I think in places like Mathare and Kibera and places like that, you will find that the communities are much stronger. They're much more, articulate in terms of what they would like to have. They may live in situations of poverty, but they are very acutely aware that they need to fight for everything.
The city is vastly bigger than the one that you and I grew up in.
Right.
Is it a happier, a better place?
I don't know. I've not seen any of the happiness indexes that are done globally, but I think, I think Nairobi is hard. It's a harsh city to be in. The cost of living is very high. The support structures are increasingly becoming less. Families are becoming more nuclear, and in some cases, single-headed households led by women, mothers, is more and more becoming the situation. So I think we're getting smaller in terms of our sense of ourselves. And increasingly, people don't fight for anything beyond their compound. You can have situations where a bar goes up outside your gate, and as long as you can get in your gate, even if you have to squeeze past the drunkards, you still think that's fine. And I think that's what we need to transform. I think what we need to do, as citizens and also as government, is really give people a sense that really they have a say in this. They have a choice in how this goes. And the city, after all, is nobody else's but ours.
Well, that's it from Talk to Al Jazeera in the field. I hope, like me, you've learnt some more about one of Africa's great cities. From Barnaby Phillips in Nairobi, goodbye.